Okay, good afternoon, America, and good evening, England. And first of all, I just want to thank everybody at Lockdown University who facilitates the ability to have these lectures all around the world. And I want to thank Hannah, who welcomes me each time, for her kindness and her help, and her inspiration in being able to put this on, because I'm absolutely useless when it would come to many aspects of the use of computers. But thank you, Hannah. Now, Istanbul, which we're dealing with today, is one of the most fascinating cities in the world. It has a history which expands 1,000 years and more, and it takes itself back even to the very beginning of time, as we shall see. The very names here on the slide in front of you indicates, and this often indicates, a long history and a change of atmosphere and often rulers when they changed the names. And it was called Byzantium or Byzantion, which are interchangeable, for a lengthy period. And eventually it would become Constantinople with Constantine, who would then take this as the eastern part of world Christianity, which would eventually be divided between Western Christianity and Eastern Christianity. And Constantinople would be the name of the city from around the year 330 and onwards, and would retain that name for 1,000 years, in fact, till 1923. The name Istanbul did actually exist probably most of that time, but it wasn't used in the way that we know it today. By 1923, with the establishment of the new capital, the new area of what was Turkey as a republic, then it took on the name of Istanbul. Istanbul means to the city. And in fact, if you put forward letters in 1923, after the rise of Ataturk and the change of the reality of what Turkey was, and you put forward the name of Constantinople on letters to the main post office, those letters were completely rejected. Constantinople was not there to be known of all that time. Now, it did change the power base, because although it was the Ottoman Empire, in 1453 it went from being a great Christian empire to becoming, under Mehmed II, it became a great Islamic empire. And so many of the aspects of Istanbul have changed. What has been a Christian church has become a Muslim mosque. What has been a Christian tower has become a Muslim or non-Muslim. And then gradually, with the secularism of 1923 under Ataturk, many of these places would then become museums. So they were all changing, as you would see in much of the world. Now, Turkey has this exceedingly large country. We are talking about Istanbul. Istanbul is unique as the only capital city in the world which is divided between two continents, where you have Europe and you have Asia on the other side. So the one time you're in Istanbul in Europe, and then you cross over and you go into Asia. European side is the main hub, economic hub of the city. And this here is between the Black Sea, the Bosphorus Strait, into the Sea of Marmara, connecting ultimately to the Mediterranean. So this, the Bosphorus Strait, is an incredibly powerful and important location. And in this country here, in its enormity, it stretches far to the east, all the way to Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, and all those other countries. So it holds a very important place. Now, whilst dealing with the antiquity of Turkey, I was in a cab in Istanbul where the cab driver claimed that their authenticity went back much further than any other country, because it said it is the origins of both Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of the Bible in Genesis, and of Mount Ararat, which is there in the map which we've just seen, which if we go all the way to the east here, it is at Mount Ararat. And that, according to tradition, is the mountain on which Noah's Ark landed. And over the decades, the last few decades, there have been a number of occasions where they've done immense research to discover some sort of origins of a possible ark on Mount Ararat. The only problem with it is that many of the people who either claim that that is Mount Ararat of Noah's Ark and that Abraham came from a Turkish city is where we would know as Ur of the Chaldees is questionable, because many of them would say, well, actually, that's more likely to be in a place in Iraq. And that in many ways would seem to be more authentic, because that is the region and the origins of most of the stories of the Bible come from, rather than Turkey. But as far as the Turkish country is concerned, they see that Mount Ararat and Abraham are one of their own. Now, there is a thing called the Book of Abraham, which I don't often use as a source book, but actually comes from the Latter-day Saints or the Mormons, where they also claim that Ur of the Chaldees and where it was, and they go on to say, well, it's not actually in Turkey, but it is in Iraq. But nonetheless, the Turkish world is happy with the belief. Now, this is a closer map of Istanbul. What you have here of this area is the Asian side, and this is a European, and this through here is known as the Golden Horn, famous Golden Horn. And within this area here, you've got the Topkapi Museum, and on this stretch, up here would be some of the most famous hotels, of the top hotels of the area. Istanbul is full of places of interest, and you would easily spend 3 days in Istanbul viewing all the things. Now, one of the most famous places is Topkapi Museum, and we don't leave biblical matters quite behind yet. The Topkapi Museum and Library had been in existence, or was in existence, from 1460 to the mid-19th century, and it served as the administrative center of the Ottoman Empire and the main residence of the sultans. And therefore, it had many, many rooms, and you go walk around there, and you go into some magnificent rooms and areas, and one of them would be the harem, which had been kept on, and it stayed in that state until 1923, when the Ottoman Empire came to an end after the First World War, and it then became a secular state. Now, the government decree said, therefore, that the Topkapi is no longer the center for the sultans, that could hardly be, or an administrative center of the Ottoman Empire, which no longer existed, but now became a museum. And in this museum are some of the greatest treasures of the world. One of them is known as the spoon maker's diamond. Now, many of you may have diamond rings, but I doubt whether any of you have a diamond ring which is 86 carats. 86 carats. And there's also the Topkapi dagger, which is filled with emeralds, which are green, which is the color of Muhammad. But more coming back to biblical and very questionable claims is the whole aspect of relics. Now, the world has always, certainly within Christianity, has always felt a great need and a great love of the finding of relics. And many of these would often be the wood from the cross, which Jesus was crucified, and other such things. But here we have claims to back up the Islamic faith, and you have within this museum the mantle of Muhammad, the sword and bow of Muhammad, even the beard of Muhammad, and a seal and letter. Here you have what they claim is the staff that Moses used in the book of Exodus when he walked around and carried out all the miracles in Egypt. And this is put down, there's a plaque in front of it stating that this is the staff of Moses. over here with markings that are not quite certain what they are, but this is construed as being the sword of David, of King David. Correctly, they would say it really should be the sword of Goliath, because David took away the sword from Goliath, and with that sword, he cut off the head of Goliath in the biblical story. It is highly unlikely, if not absolutely impossible, that these are those. There've been carbon dating on these, and it's probably from the Middle Ages or thereabout. But nonetheless, within the museum, they hold a special meaning, and the whole museum is infused with Islamic music playing, giving a continuous feeling of spirituality while you are in there. The area of Galata is an area where many of the Jews lived in Istanbul, and the Galata Tower is another example of what was known, in fact, in the past as the Tower of Christ. Therefore, you can see where it's coming from. But today it was built as a watchtower, understandably over the Bosphorus, and today it is a museum. It has been destroyed and burnt and burnt and destroyed, as goes on all the time with things which exist for many hundreds of years. And it has been there since 1348 and actually established in total, as it says there, in 1204. One of the most interesting subjects, which is not always known about, that in 1638, a gentleman known as Hasan Ahmed Chelebi decided that he could fly. And he was considered the first man in history, or one of the first men in history, who would attempt to actually fly with a technique where he constructed wings. And he was going to fly from what was there, Europe, all the way to Asia. The story is highly unlikely, but it nonetheless is a nice story, and that is one which is always told around when you go and visit the Galata Tower. Islam is a major influence in Turkey, and if it declined when the Republic came about in 1923, by today it has returned to much more of Islamic influence, as we well know, the emphasis in the politics of Turkey. Now, part of the Islamic world underwent a change similar to the rise of the Hasidic world in the Jewish world, where the Jewish world was seen as being too Talmudic, too rigid, too stuck in its ways. And the Hasidic movement came along of spirituality, of an emphasis on the divine, the emphasis on God, prayer, movement, music. And this is exactly what you have in Sufism, which was a mystic body, a part of Sunni Islam. They concentrate on areas of purification, of spirituality, of ritual, asceticism, and is known generally as Islamic mysticism. They are known as Sufism from the clothing which they wear, from the word Sufi, meaning wool, or one who wears wool. And they believe that you should go for an improved life in this world, not just concentrate on the future world, but you should bring God into our day. And they saw that Islam was the best religion for this. They then went into certain types of prayer ritual. And these prayer rituals, which are dhikr, are now viewed as a tourist item. And when people go to Istanbul, you'd spend a night going to watch the dervishes who whirl around in a certain way. They recite, they spin, they have music, they dance, and they're part of this meditation. And they believe that the very movement which they carry out is a reflection of the divine, and to bring about the divine into their lives. At first, they don't spin round like this, but they put their arms in front of them. The hat is seen as something, in a way, part of their ritual. The hat represents a tombstone, and the rest of it represents the shroud. You are to rid yourself of ego. And they rid themselves of ego by putting their arms around themselves. So when you look at them, they look as a central column going one. They are just one unit. But when they dance, they spin around where the right hand is they're connecting now with earth and heaven. The right hand goes up towards the heavens, and the left hand is lower down, as it were, facing towards the earth. Now, this is not actually very popular. In Turkey, the Sufis were banned. It was not acceptable to be part of the Sufis at all in the Republic of Turkey. But there is a strange, leave it on one influence, which they had on the Jewish world. Now, one of the people were Bachya ibn Bakuda, who wrote a book called Duties of the Heart. But more well known was the son of the Rambam, or Moses Maimonides, one of the greatest rabbis of all time, and certainly of the Middle Ages. And his son Abraham believed that within Sufism there was something which he could learn about, which could help him in his Judaism. And I quote to you from him. He wrote a book in Judeo-Arabic, which they wrote in those days in Arabic. And he says he appreciates and wants to have an affinity with Sufism. Says he, you are aware of the ways of the ancient saints of Israel, which are not, or but little practiced among our contemporaries, that have now become the practice of the Sufis of Islam on account of the iniquities of Israel. In other words, we have sinned and they have brought into their world something which we would benefit from. So to him, this was something, was a form, Sufism of Islamic mysticism could enhance Jewish mysticism. And he included in his prayer ritual the washing of feet and the washing of hands, which is Islamic and would never be part of the Jewish world. Now, whilst we deal with Islam, let us now move on to the Ahrida Kahal Kodesh. This is the Ahrida synagogue of 1430, as it says right there, and is it located in Europe. It was built by the Greek Jews, Romaniots, who are different. They have their own way of doing things. And it attracted into it many of the Sephardim who would flood over from Spain and Portugal. Now, it is one of the two ancient synagogues on the Golden Horn, and the Sephardim celebrated this synagogue by building, this is the gate into the synagogue, or doors into it. But here we have a rather unique, in the Ashkenaz world, we call this the Bimah. In the Sephardi world, we call it a teva. This is the place from where the leader of the prayers leads the prayers. And it is shaped like a boat. So how is the Ahrida synagogue, built in the 15th century, having a teva, a bimah, shaped like a boat? And that is because they too took on the idea that they were living in the country of Mount Ararat where Noah's Ark came down. And the name in Hebrew for the Teva is also, of course, Teva is a history from the language of an ark as well. And they also said because it was boats that brought over the Sephardi Jews. Interestingly, it is a synagogue in which a man called Shabbatai Savi prayed in his day. But we will move on to Shabbatai Savi a bit later. With the decline of Iberian Jewry in the 14th century, certainly from 1390 with what we would call anachronistically pogroms, Christian pogroms against the Jews in Spain, where the Jews were forced in many ways compelled to convert to Christianity, or many fled. There was one country, one area, which actually welcomed in the Jews. Well, a number of areas did actually, but we will just deal with the Ottoman Empire of the time. Said he, Yitzhak Sephardi, who was the rabbi there, whose origin from the Hebrew Sephardi means his origin was French, he welcomed in and he wrote to the communities of the Rhineland, of Moravia, of Hungary, and he said, I assure you, Turkey is a country of abundance where if you wish, you will find rest. This is as good as you're going to get, so I would come here. Said he, I proclaim to you that Turkey is a country which lacks nothing, and where, if you will it will be well with you. And the following years witnessed a massive emigration of Jew to Turkish lands. There was also the Sultan Bayezid II, who in 1492 also welcomed. So if the Jews had suffered from 100 years of discrimination in Spain and the forcing of many Jews to convert and became known as conversos or new Christians, and therefore they tried to exist both as Jews underground, but also to be Muslims or Christians in this case, Christians above the ground. Therefore, when they had the opportunity of getting out of Spain and then Portugal, they would flee, and one of the places they went was the Ottoman Empire. And one of the people that welcomed them was the Sultan Bayezid II. Said he, in view of the Alhambra decree expelling the Jews from Spain under the rule of Ferdinand and Isabella, he sent out proclamations throughout the empire that the refugees were to be welcomed. He granted the refugees permission to settle in the Ottoman Empire and become Ottoman citizens. And he said, you in Spain say Ferdinand and Isabella are such wise rulers? You think that? Who would impoverish their community by expelling the most valuable people which you have? And these people went from being the most valuable people in Spain ultimately to becoming the most valuable, some of them the most valuable people in the Ottoman Empire. So much so was he to look after his Jews that he threatened with death anybody who would criticize or kill or injure a Jew. One of the most successful Jews was Beatriz de Luna Mizquez, who was born in Lisbon, in Portugal, and a family of those very Jews, crypto Jews. They were Jews in secret, but Christians on the outside. And when she had the opportunity, now known as Gracia Mendes Nasi, as you see here, the name, when they had the opportunity to get out of Portugal, they fled to the Ottoman Empire. She was part of the Portuguese Sephardi community. She was a philanthropist. She was a great businesswoman, and she became one of the most wealthy and influential women in Renaissance Europe, in the whole of Europe. And she married very well. And it's interesting, when she married her husband, Francisco Mendes Benvenista. She married him in a Jewish wedding in a basement of a house, so nobody would witness it, and then followed that by a Catholic ceremony in Lisbon Cathedral, which everybody saw. And she, as a crypto Jew, then dealt in spice, in silver, and many other areas. She also helped Jews escape. She spent a lot of her money in bribing others to be able to take the Jews out of Spain and Portugal. When her husband died, who was buried, she got his body out and got the agreement of the Pope to allow his body to be taken to the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. Such was her power. Now, she went on to have amazing power all the time. She set up her networks, And she was known, eventually she goes to Ferrara in Italy, and there for the first time she can admit to being a Jew. And she practices Judaism and she adopts the Hebrew name of Nasi. And she throws off the Bene Vista name in the same way. She was one of the greats. Now, also in this area of Constantinople, we get something known as the polyglot Bible. Now, this particular one is of 1546. The idea of printing came to the world and to the Jewish world at the very latest, the very end of the 15th century. And by the 16th century, we're beginning to get a flourishing of the printing of Hebrew works. There was no end to what the Jewish people, those who were exclusive and could afford to buy books like that, to actually have a printed work. And they came about then what were known as the polyglot Bibles. A polyglot meant it was a Bible which had within it a number of languages: Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Aramaic, all within the same sheet. This is the center from the book of Exodus. It was found in the Geniza, and it contains within it, even in Hebrew letters, it is in other languages, and it contained many of different areas, all in the one Bible, and was unique at its time. The polyglot Bible then got increased in numbers as a result of a family known as Soncino, who came over from Italy. And in 1503, and they established a printing press in Constantinople. And by 1530, it was then the biggest printing house in Constantinople. And the Soncino name would be extremely familiar in the Jewish world, especially within England. Living at the same time was Rembrandt. Now, Rembrandt was always interested in those people who came from different parts of the world. He had a need to be able to paint people who came from more esoteric and different areas who were unknown. And he developed this pronounced ability to paint in what is known as chiaroscuro. And this is where you have dark and light, shadow and darker. And he was an absolute expert in paintings of that style, which was also seen in people like Caravaggio. But here you can see it just within this one painting. So here, his right hand, you can see, is in the light, and the left hand is in the shadow. So the shadow of the cloak, the lighter side of the cloak. And this is a dramatic individual with a turban, a beard, and great clothing. The particular way that he actually wrote or painted then was known as tenebrism. And tenebrism was a technique which was used in order to show something in a spotlight effect. And this was very much of Rembrandt and was not seen amongst many other painters, certainly not at the time. And he outlines the individual's face who here with his eyes piercing in towards you. Rembrandt brought this concept of painting to our attention. The man is probably unknown. Whilst often they would use people that they knew, this is a style which is known as trony, which is not probably of any particular individual. Let us go on to a person who lived in the 17th century at the same time as Rembrandt, and his name is Shabbatai Tzvi. Now, he is one of the most famous, and many would say infamous, personalities of early modern Jewish history. Shabbatai Tzvi was the most famous false Messiah, some would say the second most famous false Messiah of all time. Shabbatai Tzvi was Sephardi, And he was a Jewish mystic. He was born in the city of Smyrna, which is Izmir, and he was born in 1626. And he practiced asceticism and Kabbalah, mysticism, and he's also read from the Zohar, which was a mystic book. And he gradually developed in the 17th century. He was swept up in messianic belief, which encompassed Christianity and also brought in Judaism, that the world was about to embark on the messianic development. In the Christian world, it was believed that the year 666 plus 1,000, the millennium year of that, 1666, would see the second coming of Jesus Christ. At that same time, the Jews believed that 1648, for reasons we won't go into now, was also to be a year in which the Messiah would come, based on lines which they learned out from different biblical or non-biblical works. Shabbatai Tzvi met up with a man known as Nathan of Gaza, and Nathan of Gaza sold this gentleman as the Messiah. And posters were posted. I have a copy of one. The posters were sent out all around Europe. There are only 3 extant in the world today, announcing Shabbatai Tzvi as the Messiah. Eventually, Jews around the world are literally packing up their bags and selling up and going ready at the ports to ship themselves off to the Holy Land, because when the Messiah comes, the Holy Land will be the place to be. During that period, in 1658, he goes to Constantinople. He's gone after the time of the massacres of the Jews in Poland, which also is a period with intense messianic fervor. If we're being massacred, it must be for a reason. It must be the coming of the Messiah. He marries a girl called Sarah, and whilst in Constantinople, he then is said, according to Nathan, that he will claim the throne of the Sultan and his crown and his head, and he will become the ruler, in a way, of the Ottoman Empire as the Messiah. Well, the Sultan wasn't going to take that. So Shabbatai Tzvi was arrested. And he was in prison in Constantinople. He was visited by some rabbis from Lvov in Poland, who said quite clearly, this is no Messiah. This man is a charlatan. And he was held before the leaders in Constantinople, and they said to him, well, you've got a choice. You can either die through arrows being fired into you, we can just impale you, or I'll come to that, if you can just convert to Islam. And he looked at all the different options and he said, well, I'll convert to Islam. So that's what he did. And he changed his name. He became Mahmoud Effendi, changed his name. And the Jewish world was in the effect of it, went on for generations, even 100 years later. The effects of his conversion and the falsity of his claims all just crashed into the Jewish world, where people were so disappointed that he wasn't the Messiah. Eventually, he died, as they all do, and he died in Albania, actually. This is the announcement, the enthronement of Shabtai Tzvi, and sometimes you can even see places where there are prayers for him as if he was the Messiah. When he converted to Islam, he claimed that this is part of the messianic journey. I'm the real Messiah, but in order to be the real Messiah, I have to sink into the lower echelons of the world in order to rise up. And some people followed him, and some people believed, and many did believe, even when he was dead, that he still was the Messiah. So, and these people were known as apostates, which in Turkish were the dönme. And the dönme today, there are very few of them today, there have been more, were considered to be apostates. They came over as Muslims on the outside and with very little Judaism on the inside. And they had their own newspapers, and they had their groups, and they had their councils. And eventually, there are around 12,000 of them who are buried, who mainly come from Thessaloniki, who are buried in the cemetery, the Dönme cemetery, well, it's part of this major cemetery, which is in Constantinople. And they still exist. When the Nazis came along, many of them were swept up as if they were Jews. Some say that Mustafa Kemal Ataturk was one of the Dönme, but there's absolutely no evidence to that at all. Now we return to Islam, which we should, being Constantinople, is the Blue Mosque. Just to look at it gives a sense of beauty and magnificence. And here we have the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, which was called the Blue Mosque for the amount of blue in it, was on an Ottoman imperial mosque built between 1609 and 1616, as you can see, and it is iconic. It is iconic of Ottoman architecture. And just one look at it, just is stunning, and to go into it is incredibly special. The mosque has a classical Ottoman layout. There are the classic domes you can see all around, and in this case, there are 6 minarets. And it is covered, decorated by thousands of Iznik tiles with painted floral motifs, especially in the blue color. And this gives the name of the mosque as the Blue Mosque because of its overall blue color. The mosque is there with its Iznik tiles, and the Iznik tiles, Iznik is a part of was the first capital, in fact, of the Ottoman Empire, and it became a specialist area for the production of tiles and certain type of quartz tiles, which are of a very, very high quality, although today it would be very difficult to get hold of those. There's been a decline in the industry. They also knew how to do color glazing. Blue in Islam holds a special place, the concept of transcendence, of the heavens and the divine wisdom. Now here I have over here a tulip. And the tulip over here is because the tulip also has a special place in Islam in the Ottoman Empire. For the tulip represents certain divine concepts of outreach and going up, and it bends over with subservience as well. And the shape of it is in the letter of Muhammad. And so it's seen as very special. And everywhere you go there, you will see the tulip. Now, coming back to the immense, we had here Donna Grazia Mendez Nussi, who was incredibly successful. And we have also here Comondo. And many of you have written, well, not written, but read the books of the Comondo family and their association in Paris as part of the greater empire of the Commandos. This also is in the Galata area, which is the Jewish area near the Galata Tower, near the Ashkenaz synagogue. And it was constructed by a Venetian Ottoman Jewish banker who was born in Constantinople. And in 1832, he inherited a magnificent banking business, which he inherited from his brother Yitzchak, who had no children. And it is said by the time of the death of his brother, we're talking here 1830s, 1840s, he had a wealth of around 125 million francs. And he lived in the Galata district with his wife and his son. He was so well respected that being Venice, where he came from in a way, he was seen to receive the Knight of the Order of Franz Joseph, and he also received from Italy the Victor Emmanuel, a title of a count, and he was honored, and he was known as one of the great people of the Ottoman Empire. and honored by the Grand Viziers and all the ministers. Commando acted on behalf of the steppes. The steppes are here uh, from his particular design. They're known as Commando steppes, and he acted on behalf of other Jews. In 1858, he established an institute for teaching children, which he dedicated himself to, the importance of education, although that fell into some form of dispute with the rabbis because he was teaching foreign languages and they felt he should only be teaching Hebrew at that time and Jewish languages. He died at the age of 92. He lived a very long life, and he was relocated from Paris back to be buried in the Jewish cemetery in Istanbul. There were Jews. Also there we have in the Ottoman Empire who did not agree with rabbinic interpretation of what we would call traditional Orthodox Judaism, which is an adherence to the laws laid down in the oral tradition, not just the written. And the Karaites didn't go along with it. They were a breakaway all the way from the 9th century. And they believed that you should only keep the laws according to the laws within the Torah itself. Anything outside the Torah, anything learned out from it, is not part and parcel of what should be Jewish law. So in Jewish law, it said you shouldn't have any lights on the Sabbath. They would have no lights. If you couldn't cook hot food because you couldn't cook, they said, well, they wouldn't have gone along with the idea of doing things before to be able to have lights and to be able to cook. And they were known as the Karaites. They too, interestingly, there are in Eastern Europe as well, Karaite groups. They're in Jerusalem, and they have a synagogue here, which has been for quite a while in Istanbul. There are not many Karaites left. They are different from the Ashkenazim. Now, the Ashkenazim are but 4% of the of the Turkish community, Jewish community. Majority are Sephardim. But the Ashkenaz synagogue is next to the Galata. If you walk down from the Galata towers, you walk down the narrow street, past all the different security guards, and in between different little bits of shop, you come to what is this Ashkenaz synagogue, which is a very attractive synagogue with a museum in it as well. Its origins, 1900, are in Austrian. It was known as the Österreichische Temple, and eventually it would become the hub of the Ashkenaz Jewish community in the 19th century in this city of Istanbul. There were 3 Ashkenaz synagogues in that part of Istanbul, and this is basically the last one that is still around. At the height of the population of the Jews, Ashkenaz Jews, there may have been 10,000 Jews in Istanbul, Ashkenaz Jews, which would have been an enormous number. But by today, if there are 500, it would be a lot. Let me come towards the end, with interesting facts. First of all, here we have David Ben-Gurion, who was David Grun, and here we have Yitzchak ben Tzvi, one the first Prime Minister of Israel, and the other one the second President of Israel. And believe it or not, when walking down the streets in the narrow part of Istanbul, one was looking for the plaque which did exist saying Ben-Gurion lived here in Istanbul. It has been a long time removed with the relationship between Turkey and Israel. Now, Ben-Gurion and his friend Ben Tzvi had a great attraction to the Ottoman Empire and therefore to Constantinople and thus to what we would then eventually call Istanbul. And Ben-Gurion came there to study in the university, to study law in Istanbul University, in order that he would speak Turkish and eventually to be able to apply to be a member of parliament within the Turkish mainland. That was his idea and his ideal. And he was a friend of Ataturk. And Ataturk had himself traveled to what was then Palestine. And he had met with others involved in the establishment, and they were both interested at the beginning of the 20th century in establishing new countries. They both wanted to develop some specialness of their countries. Ben Gurion, the state of Israel and a Jewish state, and Ataturk for a secular rather than Islamic or Christian state in Constantinople. So their ways and their theories went together much of the time. They eventually fell out, not so fell out as just came apart, because Ben Gurion insisted on a democratic advance for any country, whilst Ataturk allowed himself to be sucked into something which was not democratic, and Turkey has never really been democratic ever since. But others also visited. You can see their pictures here as well, Ben Gurion and Ben Svi, and they're wearing here the tarbush. So not only would they speak Turkish, which he did, not only would he go to university, which he did, but he would dress. He had the moustache. He specially stated he had the moustache of the Turks, and he wore a tarbush, which is the word of fez. And many others also had a particular interest, whereas Ataturk was changing the Arabic language or writing of the language into the Latin way. Ben Gurion was there, Herzl traveled there, Ze'ev Jabotinsky went into the area as well. All of them visited Turkey, and Turkey became this area of them because it was part of the Ottoman Empire. Let me end even further. Is Turkey, the Jews, and the Holocaust a particularly complex subject, particularly involved also with a lot of areas of dispute? Because even when Turkey introduced, for instance, lately, the ideas of a Holocaust Day, it was only on certain agreement that Israel would not make any mention of the Armenian genocide. As long as you didn't say anything about that, we will say nothing about that. So they came to an agreement. Now, Turkey did help, and there were people who did help the Jews, and there were areas where they saved Jews. But at the same time, Turkey also refused to take back Turkish Jews back into Turkey. They were in other countries. And they didn't, and it was a neutral country, but they had a lot of affiliation during the Second World War with the Nazis as well. They're led on in 1942. This was a Struma. Throughout the war, countries like Romania were sending through the Black Sea, ultimately to get into past Istanbul, to get into the Mediterranean, to get to the Holy Land and save Jews from the Holocaust. And hundreds of ships, if not hundreds, dozens of ships, sailed through in a rickety way, really unfit for what they were being asked of, but they saved many Jews in that way. The Turks did not particularly aid what was going on. Finally, we come to the famous Struma. This is one of the most famous incidents. It failed. Its engine failed. And when it arrived in Istanbul, it had to be pulled by smaller boats in order to be able to actually establish itself. To slip through then, in order to get to the Sea of Marmara, it also was then tugged by other tugs. The people on board, who are now, the numbers are debated, but it's probably all in all with other people there were 791 people on board, plus others as well. So around 800, 900 people were on board in a ship which was old. It was 19th century. It couldn't even move. Its engine didn't start. And if it started for a bit and it floated off Istanbul, and the Turkish authorities would not let the Jews in, even though they knew the boat was unfit, and even though they knew the people were starving and they didn't have enough food and water, although some was allowed in. And eventually The boat was just allowed to float away from Istanbul. And then on February the 24th of 1942, a torpedo from a Russian ship hit that and killed 781 refugees and 10 of the crew. There was only one, actually, there were two survivors. One was somebody who worked on the ship, and the other was David Stolia. And David Stolia survived and was picked up eventually by Turkish boats. He was the only one survivor of all those that died trying to get to the Holy Land. And even though they had put out posters around it saying, "Save us," it didn't happen. When Stolia got into Turkey, Istanbul, they imprisoned him for quite a while. That was the incident. The other famous and more famous incident to do with Turkey, because Turkey was the center of the spy network of the world, or certainly of Europe in many ways. There were in Istanbul, there were people from the Yishuv in Israel, there were people from Germany, there were spies from Britain, there were spies from the North Africa, and they all gathered, everybody knew they gathered there in Istanbul in the clubs and in the drinking haunts that existed. In 1944, after the Germans had invaded Hungary, they were willing, cutting this short really, they were willing to establish a possibility of negotiating with the Jews. So they said that if you give us something, we will allow some Jews to live. And there were those, one was Kastner and the other one was his right-hand man, Joel Brand, who were there, as it were, negotiating with Eichmann, whose face I deliberately cut off, negotiating with Eichmann, who was the head of 4B4, the section dealing with the Jewish question, and because the Germans knew that the war was coming to an end, and maybe there were areas of negotiation, and if Eichmann wouldn't negotiate, then maybe his number two would negotiate. And eventually they came up with this idea of Blut gegen Waren, blood for goods. And they said, "I'll tell you what," they said to the Jews, "you give us 10,000 trucks, that's a bit of coffee, a bit of tea, a bit of this and that, and we will give you 1 million Jews." Sounded reasonable, they said. And they sent eventually, Eichmann sent Brandt to Istanbul to negotiate this agreement. And Brand traveled with urgency. And he got to there, and he met with others, of whether it was of the Yishuv from Palestine, or it was with the British, or anybody else. And he said at that moment, he said, Hungarian Jewry is being murdered at a rate of 12,000 Jews every single day in Auschwitz. 12,000 Jews a day. I need your answer now. I need you to give me what we need. And the Germans had agreed that the trucks won't be for they would only use them on the Eastern Front. It was a ruse. Brand had traveled with a man called Bandy Gross. And Bandy Gross was an unsavory, little bit Jewish, a little bit not Jewish, quadruple agent. He was an agent for the British and for the Germans, and he traveled with him, and nobody knew why he was traveling with him. The British rejected any semblance of a moment which we would agree to possibly have anything. We're going to give all those trucks to the Germans. You must be joking. And well, anyway, what are we going to do with 1 million Jews? What are we going to do with them? We can't save them. It's complete nonsense. It was a game of poker. And they all knew it was a game of poker, the others. The Jews were playing a hand which they were never going to be able to save 1 million Jews. And the Germans knew they were never going to save a German Jews, and they were never going to get 10,000 trucks, and they would have nothing of it. So why did Bandy Gross go to Israel? What was going on in Istanbul in 1944 had nothing to do with saving Jews or getting trucks. It was, as Himmler said, the whole Jewish business is a blind. We wanted a negotiator. He wanted to negotiate in Istanbul for conditional surrender. Oh, Karl Hitler won't know, but I'll have conditional surrender. Of course, the Allies could never have agreed to that. I want to end just on this because I don't want to end on the Holocaust business. I want to end something a bit brighter. And here we have, this is the Blue Mosque. You saw the outside of it. And here is the inside of the Ashkenaz synagogue, and you can see it. And this is known as Techelet. This is the blue strands of Tzitzit. And all of it is dominated by the color blue. So what is it special about? Let me end with the beauty of the color blue. In Islam, as I said, blue symbolizes transcendence and the heavens. It represents the sky. It represents the infinite. It represents the then divine justice and creation. It represents Allah's ability to create, and it has a spiritual depth to it. Judaism, the question is often asked, why are the tzitzit blue? Rabbi Meir says, and why is the dome of this synagogue blue? Because of all colors that could have been chosen, blue was chosen because blue is the color of the sea. The sea reflects the sky, and the sky is the entry, as it were, to the sapphire of the throne of glory of the heavens of God himself. And so we pray that the world will be enveloped in a lot more glue as well, actually, and blue. And thank you very much. And over to you, Hannah.
Thank you. That was fabulous. We have just a couple of questions and comments here, so if people want to write in further, please do. Shelley asks, how could Donna Gracia admit to being Jewish in Italy? Wasn't the Inquisition there too?
Right, because there wasn't uniformity in how Jews could. So, what would apply in one part of Italy or one part of the world would not be how it was in another part. There was no consistency in papal authority in how Jews were treated. So that the Jews, for instance, could be thrown out of one particular country, and sometimes over an area of a country, and move into another. So Ferrara was one area where Jews were allowed to admit to be Jews. It was really as simple as that. And she took that great opportunity of becoming Jewish again.
Yes,
Yes.
and the listener Rita has a sort of reiterated what you just said. So thank you for that. And Michael notes many years ago, I spent an evening in Ferrara. It has a great medieval town center. My host told me that the Jews of Ferrara suffered greatly under the Germans when withdrawing from Italy.
Yes. Ferrara, they have now a new museum there, which is worthwhile going to. Um, to museums are always popping up all over the place, and that was the Garden of the Finzi Continis. I think was also written about what went on in Ferrara. The interesting thing about the Garden of the Finzi Continis is that many people think it was true, but actually it was a piece of fiction. But it sums up what it was to be Jewish in that particular area at the time of the Second World War.
Nerith says, in the old Haifa cemetery is a memorial headstone for the Strum.
Thank you. That would be good.
Joel says, thank you very much from Buenos Aires, the only city outside of Israel with a kosher McDonald's.
Well, you're not talking about Istanbul there. You're talking, yes. I've been to that one in Buenos Aires. Yeah, great city, Buenos Aires. Uh, yeah, much more difficult to get kosher in Istanbul now.
Rena says, beautiful, fascinating. Thanks so much. Looking forward to your next presentation. Lali says, Kaduri built a hospital in Balat in Istanbul.
Sorry, can you say that again? I didn't quite hear that.
I may have not pronounced everything correctly. Kaduri built a hospital in Balat in Istanbul.
Oh, okay, yes, yeah, the Kaduri family. Yeah.
Yeah. Della says the color blue is also supposed to keep flies away.
Well, yes, well, I'm trying to spiritualize it a bit. I hadn't quite thought of it in that way. And certainly is the Islamic spirituality and the Jewish spirituality that doesn't may well be so. In fact, the color blue is also used in Christianity. You'll often see in Renaissance paintings that the Madonna is often in a blue cloak or blue dress. So the color blue has a special, maybe it was the way they could obtain blue, very special. But the blue color in Judaism goes all the way back to biblical times, based on a particular snail which came from the sea, and it issued a type of blue dye, uh, chalazon, they were called, and therefore this blue dye. So that's how blue came into Judaism.
Esther
Hopefully,
says, thank you. My mother's family lived in Istanbul as Spanish Jews, and my mother's two nephews are still living there.
yeah. There are not so many Jews. There are about, what, 14,000 Jews in Turkey altogether now. The numbers are greatly reduced. It's not a very comfortable place to be in. I did take tours there, but I wouldn't go there now necessarily. Yes, just one more
Lorna,
question.
sure. Lorna's wondering, are the dervish dancers all men or do women take part? And thank you for your most interesting and informative presentation.
Yeah, Dönme, the women, they would have so it's interesting with the Dönme, they would have many differences. For instance, they would turn all the fast days into feast days. And they would, whilst in traditional Judaism, we have three foot festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. He said, Shabbat Tzvi, that he would keep all the festivals in on one occasion, which actually sounds quite a good idea, really. So it wasn't all bad. And women were treated as well as women were treated in those particular days.
Uh, okay, to take one more question.
Okay, I'll take one more.
Anna says, how about the scientists that were allowed in Istanbul and the letter from Einstein?
Yes, because one runs out of time. Einstein himself never actually went to Turkey, but he appealed for over 100 scientists to be able to get out of Germany and go to Istanbul, and the Turkish authorities didn't allow them in. So, that, as I said, the story of Turkey and the Jews in the Second World War is very mixed. There are bits which are where they're rejecting Jews, but maybe these scientists were of such a high level of importance that they were more easily welcomed in. I think it could do that. But yes, certainly Einstein was part and parcel of that. He wrote that letter.
Thank you so much. There's lots of notes of appreciation and praise that I have not read out, but everyone was very grateful for today's presentation.
Thank you,
So
Hannah.
thank you.
I'll see you next time.
Perfect. Have a good evening and good afternoon,
You
everyone.
too. Good afternoon.